Good afternoon to all of you. Well, it's a difficult task after such a fascinating panel to be here in front of you to speak about migration. First, because a keynote speaker is by definition a single person, a male in this case. So from that point of view, I mean, a disadvantage. And secondly, because it was extremely enlightening, the exchange of views. Now I promise to you to speak about boring things. And the boring things are about the dialogue between the European Union, the European member states, and Africa. When Philippe Botton asked me to speak, I said, well, there are two prerequisites to address the dialogue between Europe and Africa when it comes to migration. The first one is building mutual trust, and the second one is to have a sense of shared responsibilities between Europeans and Africans when it comes to managing migratory flows. It might come as a surprise to you that today my assessment is that in the very recent years there has been significant and positive progress both in creating mutual trust among the stakeholders and also in sharing responsibilities when it comes to management of migratory flows. In fact, if you go back 10 years ago, probably the dominant speech, the dominant discourse would be from the African side that Europeans were only focused on preventing migrants to come, on reinforcing their border controls, and above all, in outsourcing a sort of an advanced guard of border control upon the shoulders of the neighboring African countries. But 10 years ago, most probably, the Europeans would look to the Africans and would say, well, Africans are indifferent to migratory flows. They don't put migration top of the agenda. They don't care about the fate of those who migrate, even if they migrate irregularly, taking enormous risks for their own lives, because what counts for Africa when it comes to migration is the ways of the remittances that migrants send back home, whether they are regular migrants or irregular migrants in the countries of destination. Well, I think that in these very recent years, we can say with some certainty that this kind of mutual blame game is over. And to a large extent, the evidence that the two continents are so intertwined when it comes to migratory flows that both continents are condemned to confront their different interests, because of course they have different interests when it comes to migration, provided they can put at the center stage of their concerns the dignity, the security, and the respect of those human beings that for one reason or other are on the move. Of course, the recent events did help to create this mutual ground of dialogue. On the European side, probably the push factors were not the best ones, were not for the best reasons. But there is today in Europe, in my view, a broader vision of the absolute need of cooperation with countries of origin and countries of transit, and above all, this broader vision was pushed ahead by the impacts of the massive arrival of migrants and refugees in the year of 2015. It has already been mentioned here, the Syrian conflict, which is on the basis of the agreement between the European Union and Turkey concerning the so-called Eastern Mediterranean route. The disruption of Libya, which made the central Mediterranean route overcharge of migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and it is on the basis of a tripartite approach between the European Union, the African Union, and the United Nations, mainly in the United Nations side, the role of the High Commissioner for Refugees and of the International Organization for Migration. And also in the Western Mediterranean route, because the situation that we are living now in the Sahel and in West Africa generates migratory flows, where Morocco has a key role to play, and the European Union has created a specific program and financial instrument, the EU Trust Fund, to deal with the management of migratory flows coming from the Sahel and the western region of Africa. But you can look also to the events on the African side. A milestone was the adoption by the African Union of the so-called Agenda 2063, where for the first time the African countries recognized that migration policy should be considered a top priority, a top political priority for the African Union. As it was said in the previous panel, in fact, 80%, I'm not wrong, 80% of the Africans that migrate, they do it in an intracontinental basis. They move from one African country to another African country. For outside Africa, only 20% of the Africans that migrate go towards Europe mainly, but also other destinations. And in the current moment, worldwide, we have all here the impression, when we read the global media, that the flow of migration is a south-north flow. In fact, the flows of migration that go from south to south are perfectly equivalent in figures to the flows that go from south to north. And more recently, the African countries have adopted two key decisions that are on the verge of being implemented and represent a major shift in the traditional approach of the African states about migration. The first one is the economic and trade agreement in the African Union framework, and in parallel, the so-called free movement area that last month reached the necessary number of member states to be put into practice. And I must say, to be very honest, that here there is a huge contrast between these relevant achievements that have been obtained by the African continent and the contrast with the setbacks that we are witnessing every day on the European side. In fact, one has to recognize that in the aftermath of the 2015 crisis, the European member states have split about migration. The reform of the common European asylum system is blocked, especially the Dublin regulation. The free movement area of Schengen is put into question. And there is a clear raise on a number of countries of the populist rhetorics that make migration the cornerstone of their political discourse. Nevertheless, above all, in Europe, the splits, the divisions, the contradictions concerning migration focus above all in the so-called internal political agenda of the European Union. Up to now, and I underline this point, up to now, the moment I speak, this split of EU member states has not yet reached, has not yet come to the external action of the European Union when it comes to migration policy, with one major exception. And the major exception I'm talking about is, of course, the adoption of the Global Compact on Safe, Regular and Orderly Migration that was endorsed by 169 member states in Marrakesh in December last year, then was voted in favor by the General Assembly of the United Nations, but a number of countries, 12 countries voted or against or they abstained, among which 7 European Union member states did not subscribe the Global Compact on safe, regular and orderly migration. And once again, if you look to the African continent, all countries of the African continent, but one, have subscribed to the Global Compact on safe, regular and orderly migration. My friends, the basis of the dialogue between Europe and Africa when it comes to migration is basically to be built upon the link between migration and development. If you recall, the Millennium Goals at the end of the last century, you cannot even see in the different goals any kind of reference to migration. If you compare the Millennium Goals with the Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called Agenda 2030, you will see that not only there are objectives concerning migration, especially Goal 10.7 about safe, orderly and regular migration, but quite a number of objectives dealing with the development of the developing world are closely linked with the impacts that migration can have in the development of those countries. And to a large extent, the target of the Sustainable Development Goals is to look to migration in a twofold way. On one side, addressing the deep root causes of migration, and on the other side, trying to improve the potential, the opportunities that migration represent for the development of the countries of origin and for the development of countries of destination. When it comes to addressing the deep root causes of migration, it has already been said during these sessions. We know very well the traditional root causes of migration that are identified: poverty, inequalities in the distribution of the income, conflicts, of course, lack of jobs, and quite often poor or weak governance. But the interesting thing is that the SDGs call the attention upon new emerging root causes of migration. The first one being definitely the situation of the so-called IDPs, internally displaced people. Persons that had to move from their region of origin to a different region inside the same country without crossing any international border, but even then in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. And today in the world, especially in Africa, IDPs represent roughly 40 million people. People that if don't find a livelihood in the new places where they have moved towards, they will go on moving, they will sooner or later cross an international border and become international migrants. The new category that needs to be taken into consideration are the ones who move because of climate change, environmental degradation, or man-made or natural disasters, as we have seen, unfortunately, very recently in Mozambique and Zimbabwe due to the Idai cyclone. In our estimations of IOM, we consider that today in the world, roughly 20 million people are on the move because of climate change, environmental degradation, and natural or man-made disasters. And a new reason for mobility, which is of extremely concern, are the pandemics and the proliferation of diseases. Especially, for instance, the Ebola crisis that we had 2 years ago in West Africa that was contained, but today, the moment we are here speaking, we have a new, very serious and disturbing Ebola crisis that started in Democratic Republic of Congo in North Kivu and is spreading to a number of neighboring countries. This holistic view of the root causes requires different answers according to the needs and the reasons for people to move. They require integrated strategies that bring together three main pillars. The first one, of course, is humanitarian assistance. Those who move are most often vulnerable people, particularly women, girls, children, unaccompanied minors. Those are vulnerable to exploitation, to sexual abuse, to trafficking and smuggling. there is an important dimension of humanitarian assistance. The second pillar, of course, is the one I mentioned, development, economic development. But the third and equally extremely important pillar is conflict prevention, peace and security that are at the origin of many movements of people in a number of countries worldwide. So the challenge that the international community is confronted is how to combine these different dimensions if we want to be consistent in addressing the deep-root causes of migration and therefore being able to respond to the needs, the vulnerabilities, and the potential of the 268 million of migrants that exist in the world today. And of course, what has happened the day before yesterday is a very clear example of something absolutely unacceptable that the international community have been calling the attention upon for a number of years and unfortunately had a tragic outcome when an airstrike in Libya killed at least 53 migrants that were in a detention center that was supposed to be a protective shelter and was attacked during the Libyan war. The vulnerability and the humanitarian protection and assistance to migrants is the first pillar and a shared responsibility of African governments, African states, but also the international community, including, of course, the European countries and European Union institutions. The second dimension, development, is probably one of the most complex ones. I won't go into the details. The idea is that it is absolutely necessary to be able to manage migratory flows, to create the preconditions for economic development for people in their own regions of origin. And that requires massive investment in education, in professional training, in vocational training, in infrastructure, and also creating jobs, which calls upon not only the engagement of the European countries, but also of the African countries. Because without a friendly environment for investment, it will be extremely difficult to create the conditions for having jobs for people who have hope to fulfill their own personal projects of life. And last but not least, I'm spoken about the situation of peace and security. Community stabilization, transition from post-conflicts to recovery, and reintegration of migrants in their communities of origin is a key element for an effective capacity of managing migration. I've heard in the previous panel that a lot is happening in Africa. Indeed, IOM is probably one of the most decentralized organizations, and when it comes to create conditions for development and to reintegrate migrants in their communities of origin, we work with local stakeholders. We overpass national governments. We work with local communities. We work with local civil society. We work with local authorities because those are the ones who are confronted with the challenges, who have a proximity relation with the migrants that have to return, and they can be helpful in reintegrating them in the societies and communities of origin. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not like to conclude without making a short reference to what I consider the disruptive or missing links in this dialogue between Europe and Africa when it comes to migration. The first one is the very limited scope of legal pathways for migration. In fact, if you see the figures, in the last decade, the number of Africans who have regularly migrated towards Europe were all above family reunification. The closing up of the European societies to regular pathways is one of the key issues that is hampering a broader and more mutually trustful cooperation between Europe and Africa. Some countries are changing their approach. in this respect. I've just came from Asia, where I was talking with the Japanese authorities. Japan is well known as a country who has always been extremely reluctant to accept migrants from the outside. Well, the discussion was all about how they will, in the next 3 years, integrate in the Japanese society 500,000 migrants. I took the opportunity also to go to China, and the dialogue was exactly the same. We are in an aging society. We have serious shortcomings in a number of economic sectors. We need to have migrants. This might come as a surprise. We are talking about a country with 1,400,000 people. And China is now talking about having regular migration to overcome the imbalances of an aging society and shortages in the labor market. Even in Europe, some countries are taking that initiative. Germany, for instance, is on the verge of adopting a new regular migration law. And Portugal also is one of the good examples where there are regular pathways towards legal migration. But there are still very isolated examples. The second element I would like to emphasize is, and is closely connected to this one, is the growing anti-migration sentiment that exists in a number of countries. We could feel tempted of thinking that this anti-migration sentiment, that is very much on the center stage of the populist discourse, is typical of the global north. But I recommend you to see a recent research done by the Pew Research Center, where you can start finding some attitudes of rejection of migration in key countries of the global south, including countries that have an historic tradition of being countries of origin. If the sentiment against migration is growing up in South Africa, in Mexico, in Kenya, or in Nigeria, for instance, we definitely are confronted with a very serious issue about how to make the destination countries accept the need and the natural flow of migration, provide the necessary policies are adopted to guarantee a smooth and harmonious integration in the societies of destination. And last but not least, we live in times of fast and deep change. Digitalization, automation will probably change in the next decade the features of our societies, of our economies, and of our labor markets. If we want to have a regular migration policy that succeeds, we need to anticipate the skills and the qualifications that will be required in these fast-changing societies so that migrants can be duly prepared to address the challenges of their movement and be successful in the countries of destination. And at the end of the day, that is the key message of the Sustainable Development Goals. No one should be left behind, including migrants. Thank you.